So, it's a great privilege today to welcome someone who has not only shaped the urban landscape of Melbourne, but has influenced city planning on a global scale. Rob Adams is an architect and urban designer whose vision has brought new life into the heart of Melbourne, transforming it into one of the most vibrant and livable cities in the world. So with over 40 years of experience, Rob's work as the Director of City Design at the City of Melbourne has earned him prestigious recognition, including an Order of Australia and Prime Minister's Environmentalist of the Year. Under his leadership, the City Design Division received over 160 awards. Very impressive. But Rob's influence doesn't stop at Melbourne borders. He's shared his expertise on the world stage, representing Australia on the World's Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Cities of Tomorrow. Since establishing his practice, Adams Urban, in 2020, he's continued to shape cities across Australia. And now I would like to hear from the man behind so many transformative projects. Rob, we are excited to have you on board today. Thank you. Over to you.
What I want to talk to you about today is the process that we've used at the City of Melbourne over a period of about 40 years now, and transformed the centre of Melbourne. And I think many of those lessons are reasonably straightforward. But before I do that, I'll just pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land I'm talking to you from, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. If you look at what is needed to make a good city, you look at the left-hand side of this slide, there are those 5 things: density, mixed use, connectivity, local character, and high quality public realm. And when those come together, they actually, through a process of adaptation, are what in fact we've used to change our own city. Those elements come from a study done by people like Chris MacDonald, and I've given you a reference down the bottom there. It's called the Value of Good Urban Design. And if you can actually put those things together, the product of that is economic vitality, social and cultural cohesion, and environmental sustainability. So we've used that document, and Chris actually worked with us back in the 1990s and taught us a lot about how we simplify the aspects of how you design cities. On the right-hand side are the mechanisms that are traditional to most planning offices. So you set a vision, you've got strategies about change, you use development control through the stat planners, and then you have action plans. And we've used all of those. So you can see under the action plan, something like Postcode 3000, which was one of our major action plans to bring people back into the city. So those are the tools to apply those characteristics that you're trying to achieve on the left-hand side. I'm going to do it through the basis of 10 projects that talk to those 5, and hopefully through this you'll get some idea of the simple things that you can do to change a city. The background to this is the city we were trying to change, Melbourne, in the 1980s, was a city that wasn't going forward. People were moving out of the city, urban shopping centres were growing up, and the centre itself was dying. We didn't have much money, so it had to be an incremental thing. So a lot about this is the incremental change you make over a long period of time. And a lot of people look for grand projects to change cities, and some of those do help. But I would argue the day-to-day things you do are the most important. And if you can get those right, then incrementally you're going to improve your city. So the first one of that is local character. And every city has its own local character. And you need to look at that rather than looking overseas or in some other city to see what they've done, because they won't give you clues as to what's important to you. And in many cases, the local character can be made up of many things, the materials and many characteristics. And I've given you on the left-hand side here the five main ones that make up Melbourne's character. You know, it's set on waterways, the Yarra and the Maribyrnong. Its built form is very distinctive. It was within a 40-metre height limit, so it was a compact city. The street pattern was planned. It wasn't a medieval city that grew from a particular crossing in a river or something like that. It was a laid-out city with a grid. Its public transport good. You have good trams, good rail systems, radial systems that come from the centre of the city out to the periphery of the metro area. And we had a good park system. Now, I can't take you through all of those because we wouldn't get through it. So I'm going to take you through one, which is the built form, and give you an idea of how you can work with that character to enhance the city. So Melbourne's built form grew up out of a very big grid. When the grid came down from the Governor of New South Wales, it was 200 metres by 200 metres. Some large blocks, and Hoddle, who was the surveyor, put a 10-metre street through the middle, which you can see running between these two grids. That grid got subdivided in the 19th century through speculation. So the way they were making money in the 19th century was subdividing some of those big blocks down into smaller properties, selling them off, and in order to gain access into those properties, they were putting in lanes and arcades. So you start to get this pattern of connectivity through these large grids, going from the south to the north. And maybe because the railway station was on the south, that pattern of movement was more north-south than east-west. And then in the 20th century, what happened is people started to look at other cities and international styles, and they started to consolidate blocks and knock down big parts of the city. And that one that you can see at the top left-hand corner of the bottom of these three grids is the Collins Place by I.M. Pei. And this was a building not of this place. This was an international building built around a central atrium and not externalizing itself. So what we were doing was knocking down streets like the one at the top and building what you can see in the middle slide, you know, these concrete blank walls, everything internalized into a shopping mall, and really denying the energy on the street. And what we decided back in the 1980s when we wrote the strategy plan is we'd stop that. Because if you do that often enough in a city, you're going to kill it. The bottom slide is many years later, after many discussions with the people who own Collins Place, where they started to externalize that building and start to actually recognize the importance of the streets. What you got, and sorry, it's very small, is right down the bottom right-hand corner, you got some 300 lanes that grew up in Melbourne. And these started to become our pedestrian network. So our streets were very wide, 30 metres, and the 10-metre streets were the service streets. But these pedestrian lanes became that pedestrian system, and we started to enhance what happened on those, giving people the ability to, you know, trade from the footpaths, etc. The next thing that we looked at is we realised that we needed mixed use and density. Every Australian city has a strong core and then a very spread out low density metropolitan area. It's not a system that's working well for us, and in fact, as we'll talk about at the end, is slowly seeing our cities fail. So what we started to realize is that particularly in Melbourne centre, there was no residential population. And what we realized is we needed to bring back a residential population. And that would provide a mixture of uses. And we could turn our city from what would be a central business district, where people came in at 8 in the morning and left at 5 after they'd finished working, to a central activity district where people came in and stayed and visited over long hours. Interestingly, we've just reached that 40 years later after COVID, where people are only working 3 days a week in the city, but our visitation on the evenings and the weekends is higher than the visitation during the days. So it's taken us 40 years of working at the strategy and COVID to in fact get to a central activities district, which is what we've got now, and a highly successful one where a lot of people are enjoying, you know, what they get from the city. The program we used to get a residential population back was called Postcode 3000, and this was about converting old office buildings into residential. It came on the back of the property market crash in the late 1980s, when a lot of new office buildings were built, and a lot of the older stock that had office accommodation in was vacated. And we took that opportunity to say, well, what happens if we repurpose some of these empty office buildings into residential, and that was postcode 3000. We put together some incentives to make that happen. Many of them were things that already existed, but we brought them into a package so that people could understand them. And what happened is every one of those red dots is 5 dwellings. In 82, we had 685 dwellings. By the time we got to 2016, we had 41, and today we have 63,000. So when you put 63,000 people in a confined area like this, you completely change the nature of your city. What happens is things like food and beverage, which was also, we had 604 back in 1982, those suddenly went up to close to 2,000. And that was because there was a population living there, and they needed places to eat. 40% of our population downtown don't own a car, so they really see the central city as their neighborhood, and hospitality was obviously something that was going to flourish. The other thing that started to flourish was retail. Retail in the 1980s had been moving out to the Chadstones and the other parts. Now what was happening was that they started to move back, and you can see we went from 1,900 retail to 2,400. And that started to actually see us competing with the Chadstones, where Chadstone was now looking at the city with its lanes and arcades and saying, maybe we need a more authentic retail experience for people if we want to keep them coming to Chadstone. The other thing that happened if you put a population in a city like that is the rates went down because there were more people in the city and municipality to pay the rates. So the cost of doing business in the city went down as well. So the third thing we were looking at is connectivity. How do people move in our city? A lot of people were coming by car. Car was the dominant form of transportation, and we knew that we had to, in fact, get a better balance between cars, bicycles, public transport. If we said we were going to do that and we were going to actually, start taking cars out of the city, we would have been stopped by the state government because they control, the major arterial streets and things like that. So what we said we would do is we would achieve a better balance for pedestrians and other people by slowly increasing the pedestrian area. And we called that program Greater Green. And it was about widening the footpaths, planting trees, and generally making the pedestrian and people environment more attractive. And at the same time, we started putting in bike lanes. And this was a typical example. This slide's very old now, but Lygon Street was one of the first ones where we came in, widened the footpaths, put the medians in, planted trees. And in doing that, we didn't cut down the traffic lanes. There were still 2 traffic lanes, but there was reduced parking during certain times. And that enabled us to slowly start taking areas away from the street and giving them to other uses. One of the major psychological moves forward was the Swanson Street. And we'd set in the strategy, which came out in 85, that we would close Swanson Street because it was a through street and people were driving through the city to get to the airport or to get to the eastern suburbs, and they weren't stopping. And this was our main civic shopping street that they were in fact driving through. So we decided we would change it, but it took us 7 years to build up the confidence in the community that this could happen, and the state government as well. And in 1992, we closed Swanson Street to through traffic, although you can still get traffic into the street. It's only for a block or 2, and then you have to turn out. And the street was dying anyway. The left-hand side of a slide you can see here, it was pretty empty. A lot of the shops were up for lease. And on the right-hand side, we started through planting the trees and bringing wider footpaths, we started bringing back people. This is what actually happened in numbers. So when we closed it in 93, there were 12,800 people at that star. You can see up at the top of Swanson Street. By the time we got to 2017, there were 47,000, and just before COVID, there were 65. This was a completely different street now, and this was what it looked like, to the extent that we started to have the footpaths so crowded that, in fact, people started to think about whether we needed to take some of the street furniture off so people could get more space. This was a process, as I said, that incrementally took place, but it was helped by the fact that we had a downtown population and the city was starting to thrive going into the 21st century. At the same time, we were developing an open space strategy, because with an increased population, and I had parks and gardens come into my area for a while, with a greater population, we needed more open space. And when we looked at it, if we had to buy the space that we would need for the new open space, it would have cost us $700 million. That wasn't going to happen. We didn't have $700 million. So what we started to do was actually continue that process of taking away from the street. And over time, we took away, over 40 hectares of, 80 hectares of, infrastructure that was being underutilized, and turned it to open space. That would have cost us $486 million had we paid for that. So it was a case of converting underutilized infrastructure to infrastructure that you needed. And here are some typical examples. You can see on the the left-hand slide, Neil Street, stopping and then running into this active park that is near our high-density housing. In the middle little slide, you can see a roundabout that was 500 square meters. On the right-hand side, by making that a one-way system around that island, we got 5,000 square meters. And so, as I said, over that period of 30 years, we had converted over 80 hectares of asphalt to pedestrian or park uses. And that was a process that, because it happened incrementally and because the community came on board as we went through, had very little opposition to it. More recently, one of the major ones we've done is South Bank Boulevard, and that runs from St Kilda Road, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, through to the river. And when we had the Commonwealth Games in 2006, we closed the bottom of South Bank Boulevard, and you had to, in fact, take a left turn, then a right turn to get across the river. And that dropped the car numbers from 30,000 to 15,000. And so we said to the engineers, if we've got half the traffic, we only need half the space. And we worked with them, and it was agreed that the space you see here in yellow and blue was space that we could take back and make into open space, and we could still carry the traffic capacity of the 15,000 vehicles on the remaining asphalt. These were some of the images we did, showing how that bottom slide on the bottom right-hand corner could be turned into a series of parks. And this is the actual thing. This is the street now closed, and move over to the right, and the parkland that you can see here. So there are 5 linear parks that make up South Bank Boulevard, and some of them are grassed like this if they sit close to residential areas. This was our playground. And this was, like many of our playgrounds, not bought off the shelf with standard items, but using material that was exciting to children to play on, and also gave a context for this place, which was built on the basalt below ground, because central Melbourne is on a combination of basalt and Coode Island silt, which is like quicksand. And there was a stream of basalt that came into South Bank Boulevard. So these 50-ton rocks of basalt were turned into a playground, and we worked with Mike Hewson, who was an engineer and an artist who I discovered up in Sydney, and invited him down to join our team. And this gave us a playground that the children find exciting, the adults find exciting, and you also get parkour jumpers, using it as well for their trade. So trying to actually use art and play in the same vein for projects. At the same time, we went through and started putting in more bike lanes throughout the city, and slowly we were upgrading those so they separated from the cars. And during COVID, we put 40 kilometers of bike lanes into the central city, and they are slowly being upgraded. We did it in a temporary fashion to start off with. The fourth thing, and where we've spent a lot of our time, is in the public realm. So why is the public realm so important? First of all, it's the space outside of the buildings. It's where we spend our democratic life, where we meet our fellow citizens. And it is the space that if it doesn't work well, the city won't work well. The interesting thing is that 80% of that space is made up of streets. So the one-liner that I've made up is, if you design a good street, you'll design a good city, on the basis that if you get 80% of the public realm right, then the rest of the city is going to feel all right. So we spent a lot of time concentrating on designing our own street furniture, paving the streets with good paving, planting trees, allowing cafes to, spill out onto the footpaths. And these slides give you a flavor for that. We also measured. Back in 1974, we realized that because we were doing things incrementally, nobody would ever know we'd been there. So we spoke to Jan Gell from Copenhagen, asked him to help us measure what we were doing, and produced this document in association with his office. And then 10 years later, we did the next one. And the changes were so dramatic that Jan got pretty excited by this and went around the world promoting Melbourne as a place that was changing itself, but also recording its data as it changed. And literally, he put us on the map. He went around saying Burke Street and Swanson Street were carrying more pedestrians than London's Regent Street. And statements like that started to make people notice that Melbourne was changing, including the local people. The fifth challenge we had was we were going into a period of climate change, and when I had the Parks and Gardens come in the early part of the 21st century, we were into what was called the Millennium Drought. And we not only had a very hot central city, we had an occasion where there were 47-degree days and our trees were dying. And so we looked at what did we need to do? And we decided what we needed was an urban forest strategy. And you can see that came out in 2012. When we did that strategy, sometimes it's important to think about the questions you're going to ask the community. If we went into the community and said, what trees do you like? I suspect we'd still be there discussing whether it's exotic or local species. So I said to the team, I don't want you to talk about trees. I want you to talk about the metrics that give you a cooler city. What's the canopy cover? We want to go from 22% to 40%. What's the diversity you need? How do you improve the health of the trees? How do you get moisture into the soil? And those became the principles on which we got the council to adopt the strategy. Once we had that, then we could talk to people about the nature of the trees. This was that nearly 47-degree day where 173 people died in 2009 in the bushfires, but 374 died out of heat exhaustion in our city. So heat is something that we're going to really have to deal with in all of our cities, and we know that now because we watch the news every night and we see California burning and Greece burning. And one of the solutions is try to actually lower the heat and keep water up to your urban forest. And that became one of our next strategies. We measured every tree in the municipality and we worked out that 48% of our trees were going to die in the next 20 years unless we did something. So there was a strong incentive to get on and actually improve it, and hence the urban forest strategy. And out of that, we plant 3,000 trees a year, and we've improved the health of our trees. So we plant trees just about everywhere. You can see the before and after, and this program had started before that occasion in 2009. So you can see Swanson Street in the middle there in 1992, and then after the trees were planted. So this was an ongoing exercise of building up our tree canopy. Once you have an urban forest, you need to get water into it, and the water is declining on our city. You can see the drop off there from the water data. So it's important actually to collect as much water as you can and store it for those periods of drought that you have. There might be simple measures like we've got here, where we actually collect it off the street into a pit where the trees 600 to 700 millimeters below the paving. So the tree gets watered before the water gets into the pipe. So our aim in life was to make the pipe the place of last resort. Try and get water back into the soil, which is the cheapest and best place to store moisture. We also, as you see on this right-hand diagram, we started to build medians so we could get permeable surfaces. So in our very wide streets in some of our residential areas, and this is Carlton, this is up in this area here, all these blue lines are where we managed to get into the middle of the street, keep a running lane, keep a bike lane, and turn the middle of the street into a planted median. And these were really sought after areas during COVID where families used to come out and actually, use the median for a bit of recreation. But at the same time, we were building tanks, and you can see, I presume you can see my cursor. You can see the tanks, which are those stars that go around the high end of the city. And they were designed to capture the water as it came downhill and use it to water the gardens, etc. But also, if we were going to get a heavy downpour, to slow down the overland flow of the city. And this is typical of one of those tanks. This is in Fitzroy Gardens at 5 million litres. You can see the size of a person inside there. And what we did to accommodate these in our very historic gardens, which Fitzroy Gardens are, is we took our depot, which was under my control as Parks and Gardens, and said we had to rationalise it. So if you can see the 4 greenhouses here, these are the 4 greenhouses over here. So you can see we decreased the footprint of the depot quite substantially, but rationalised it and put some new buildings in there so that it became a much better depot to use. Built a pavilion that we could get a cafe into, because here we've got Cook's Cottage and we've also got our conservatory. So this is where many of our visitors, international visitors, come. And then the tank is sitting underneath this green piece of grass here. And this is the rain garden that filters the water as it comes down and then puts it in the tank, which 80% of our watering of the gardens takes place out of this tank. What we did, it wasn't just a project about water, it was a project that gave back 4,000 square meters to the park. It gave us our 5 million litres, and it rationalised our depot and our visitor centre. So many of our projects are multi-pronged, and as a result, we get funding from the federal government for the water savings we were getting, and the partnerships that we started to create through this period of 40 years were the things that enabled us to, in fact, achieve the things we achieved. This is a tank underneath a street in East Melbourne, where we dug up the street, put a tank underneath, put the rain garden above in the median, and that water was used to water the gardens you can see to the left. The next strategy was, if we were actually planting trees, collecting water, getting better balance on our transport systems, putting people close to where they wanted to be, and all those things we've been doing. In 2000, the mayor said, what's our next big thing? And the next big thing was the office buildings were churning out the highest level of greenhouse gases within our central city municipality. So we said we should design a building that actually doesn't operate like that, actually uses less energy, has greenery on it, and has a healthy working environment. And that became Council House 2, which we built and opened in 2006. And it became the first building in Australia that had a 6-star Green Star rating. One of the important aspects of that building is not that it saved energy, which it did, but it also had this fresh air environment. So the air entered the floor via a plenum under the floor and rose up through the space and was taken out through these curved ceilings that were made of concrete. And the concrete was the thermal mass that we used to cool the building by opening the windows at night. The fresh air coming in put you in a situation like this chap in the beaker in the bottom right-hand corner, sitting in fresh air, and as the air became more foul, it rose up and it heated and it left. Conventional buildings do what you've got on the top. They push the air in at the top, they circulate it around so we can all share each other's germs, and then they pull it out and sometimes they circulate it again. So CH2 was the only building I had confidence in COVID that was a reasonable building to ask people to go back and work in, because we knew they were sitting in a decent fresh air environment, and the people a few meters from them weren't sharing their air. The next strategy after that was we needed to actually generate more renewable energy for the city. We needed to get people able to go to zero, non-renewable energy. And to do that, we started a program where we called the Melbourne Renewable Energy Program, which was getting partners to come into a financial arrangement with us to build wind farms. And we've done that twice. What we did was actually You can see the partners listed there. There were things like Aussie Post, Melbourne, RMIT, and some of the universities, the banks. And through that, we generated 88 kilowatt hours in the first one and 110 in the second one. So those businesses could then say the energy they were taking out of the grid was in fact green energy, because they'd actually built these wind farms, in locations just outside the city. The second part of that program, which has just started, is to put in neighborhood batteries so that you can collect the energy close to where you need it. And if anybody's got spare energy coming off their roof solar, they can put it into the neighborhood battery. They get paid for it, and then everybody can share that later on. So that program just started in the last few months. One of the biggest things, which is not seldom talked about in the city, was the partnerships we had to take assets the city owned and turn them into higher generating assets. And there were many of them, and I haven't got time to talk to all of them. One of them that's topical at the moment is the City Square. Sitting next to the City Square is the Regent Theatre that my cursor's on now. And what we decided with the City Square is we used to have a big City Square that won an architectural prize, and the Queen opened it, but except it didn't have any activity along its one edge, and the other three edges were streets. So it didn't work, and in fact it became an environment which was quite hostile, and some of the retail adjacent was failing. So we sold off part of the square to the bottom of a water wall, and with that, which is this piece here, so the open space was still the same. And with the 17.5 million that we got for that, we put it together with the state government and had the Regent Theatre refurbished. And that was then, the Mariner Group then took a lease on that, and we get 250,000 for our share every year off that. So that's an example of a private-public partnership that we did. The one I want to show you in a little bit more detail is one that's just finished in Melbourne. It's called the Munro site. It's right opposite Queen Victoria Market, and Queen Victoria Market is a big renewal project that we've been working on since 2014. As part of that, there were 720 car parking spaces sitting on an open-air car park next to the market. And one of the strategies in 1985 was that we should have no open-air car parks. They don't add to the character of the city. In fact, they detract from it. And so this was one of the sole remaining ones. And the strategy to overcome that was to buy a site next to the market into which we put 500 cars below ground. And I know building car parks in this day and age is maybe not the best thing to do, but it was 220 less than was on the surface. We then put the site out for redevelopment, and we had a community hub. We had 15% affordable housing, which was 56 units. We had our underground car park. We had 2,500 square meters of open space, plus the 1.75 hectares of open space that we were getting from removing the car park. And we had hospitality and retail. And we put it out that it had to meet 6-star Green Star rating for community. We were successful in getting the developer, and that's developed and built now. The plan you can see in the top right-hand slide has some characteristics of Melbourne. There are lanes. You can see this lane coming through from Franklin Street right through to the market, and there are lanes running east-west as well as north-south. There's active frontage around all the frontages. There's no back of house. The only back of house is an entrance to a car park for the build for rent and the public car park over here. Otherwise, all of the area is active frontages. The area we owned was the car park and this building here. The affordable housing went above us in this building here. And then we started off and sold everything above the 500 cars to the developer. They built a hotel, retail, and the build for rent. How does this work financially, that we can actually buy a site like this, and it was a financial success for us as well as the developer? Well, the little thing on this, and I apologize if you can't read it, but I'll share the slides with Book and Parasena, and they can send it around to you. We bought the site for 86 million. We spent 150 on car parking and community facilities. We subtracted the community facilities because we have to build those anyway. And we also had a return on land. So this is the return on land, which reduced us slightly. I think we got 26 million. We took away the public buildings, which slowed us down here. We then also sold off 3 buildings. Sorry, this is 7.5 million we got here from the state government for the land value of the affordable housing, because they wanted affordable housing, and so they contributed to that. Then we sold off 3 buildings because we were putting community services into this building. And then we had the value of the open space. And once you put the value of the open space in, suddenly we're back in the black, because to buy that open space would have cost us over 100 million. And this is in a very, highly populated area of the city. I'm going to finish on this next thing, which is our 10th one. It's all very fine doing that in the central city and transforming the city. But if the rest of the city is dying around you, then there's a reason for concern. And Melbourne is 2 cities, as is Perth. You have your central city, which looks like the slide on the left, and then you have your suburbs that run out, in our case, to the Dandenong Mountains. And these cities on the right are slowly failing, particularly when on the fringe. But every time that we have a problem, a housing problem, what happens? The governments push out to the fringe and the blue hatched areas and build out there. And really, that is not a solution, because if you look at all the trends that are happening out there, if you do that, you're getting more cars on the road, and this is an intersection in Melbourne on the right-hand side. We know we can get more people in public transport, and these are old slides you would have seen, but you get more people in a bus than you do in all those cars. Those buses are carrying more people in the cars. This is Punt Road in Melbourne. And we're carving up farmland to, in fact, pave it over when it's some of the best farmland we've got. And here's what you can see. We basically, lost huge amounts of farmland since 1984. And the people who are living out there are living under duress. This is a study done by Griffith University. It's called the Vampire Study. And basically what it looked at is the vulnerability of people to mortgage and petrol prices. And you can see on the one in 2001, there's quite a lot of green. That's where people are coexisting quite well and economically quite well. And you can see here creeping in more red and orange. And that's when people are starting to feel the pinch from their mortgages and their petrol prices and their cost of living. The walkability of those cities is good in the center and poor at the fringe. When you hit bankruptcy and stress rates, they're usually those fringe areas that start to suffer more than the inner areas. If we start to look at family violence, there's also a pattern that emerges. Not all family violence is on the fringe, but there's a greater number of percentage of family violence on the fringe. And you can imagine what that means in terms of long commutes and maybe only having one car when you needed 2, etc. And people using cars rather than public transport starts to lead to a health crisis. And here are some figures which I found quite staggering about the cost of obesity and diabetes in Australia. And you get people like Billy Giles Corte, who's now in Western Australia, saying you're more likely to die of a heart attack if you live in the suburbs than if you live in the central city, because you walk more once you're downtown. The other thing that happened during COVID is people suddenly realized how much their cars were starting to cost them. And the Automobile Association came out and said that a car would cost you $22,400 a year if you had to buy one to go and live in the fringe. And people suddenly working from home realized they had more money in their pocket. They weren't having to pay road tolls. They weren't having to commute to the city and pay parking. And they started to readjust their lifestyles. And so all of these things start to point to what do we need to do about this housing. And I take you back to my university in Cape Town, where I grew up in Zimbabwe, studied architecture at Cape Town University. And when I went traveling in 1969 as a fourth-year student, I noticed all the universities were expanding. But here we stuck on the side of Table Mountain, Herbert Baker design, very, very well designed, heritage listed campus. and there was no room to expand because you had national parks around you. So I asked the people on the campus what they were going to do. And at the time, they said, we've asked a different question. We're not talking about expanding. We've looked at how well are we using the stuff we've got. And what they found is that lecture theatres were being used for about 17.5% of their academic day. So they just re-timetabled. And I went back 40 years later, and the campus had one building built on it, which was this one here, which was an empty site when I was there. And they had trebled their student population. And the penny dropped for me that if you can actually take, and the vibrancy on the campus was so different to when I'd been there as a student. So if you can take a university, which is like a small city, and accommodate density within your existing infrastructure and get vibrancy out of it, why aren't we doing that with our cities? So I came back and approached the Ministry of Planning and said I thought that we could most probably double Melbourne's population without expanding at the fringe. I didn't get much reaction from the planning department, the state planning department, but Jim Betts, who is the Secretary for Transport, gave me $40,000 to look at what would happen if we put the population around the activity station centres where you have trains. This is Box Hill Station. Doesn't look like this anymore today. It's got quite tall buildings on it. You can see the central city over here, and here's a tram corridor. And what would happen if we put density along these in the activity centres and in our brownfield sites? And that was the study we did. And what we found is with the activity centres took up 3% of the city and of the metro area, and you get 860,000 people in those without expanding them and intruding into the residential area. And that was using 60% of the land and building 5 to 8 stories.
Rob, apologies for interrupting you. I'm just conscious of time. We have almost 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah, if you don't mind, if you can please wrap it up, because I'm going to ask audience if they have also any questions for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, what I'll do is I'll wrap it up by just quickly flicking through. We did the corridors. We found that you could get 2.4 million people living along those corridors by taking out all the sensitivities. And basically, this is what happened. We built along those corridors. We got high rise. And now this is what's happening in Melbourne. Here's a street a block away from me, Smith Street. We're getting 5 to 8 stories on a tram corridor where they're well serviced. And the savings for doing that are $110 billion of infrastructure cost for every million people you house. So that's the story. There's a lot of these that I could show you, and I apologize that we made such a mess of this presentation, but I will send it to you and you can flick through it yourself as I'm doing now. The last thing is to say the trams are now costing you 1/10 of what they used to, because sitting out at Stirling is a trackless tram, which is going to be put into Stirling in the next short period. So thank you for that. And I hope from that you get some new idea of what's happening.
Fantastic. Thank you. If you could please stop sharing, people could see you.
Yeah.
Rob, thank you so much. It was really great. Thanks for sharing your insight with us. Amazing projects. I think what I can see is the actual impact that your projects have had on the quality of life, like how people experience the city and design and how people live. I guess it's amazing. Sorry, can you hear me? I can hear my echo.
No, well, I'm not getting an echo. You sound fine.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, so that quality of life was evident across all the projects you explained, and as you mentioned, it has been an incremental change, but I guess really impactful. So I have one question myself, but before asking that, I would like to open it to the audience. Okay, I have one question here for you. Sarthak, Hello, Rob. These are some great strategies that you've presented, but as we increase the quality of the built environment and introduce more private funding into the cities, how do we tackle the issues of economic polarizations and social inequity within cities?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because if you ask me what project I'm proudest of, it would be Postcode 3000, bringing back a population. If you ask me what actually failed, I'd say Postcode 3000, because we got a gentrification coming through that. And also some of the built form controls were removed by the state government. So some of the later development wasn't of the quality one would have liked. The answer to that question is we've got to be more proactive in getting affordable housing. The only thing that changes in any development scenario, if you start to put impositions on a developer, is the cost they're prepared to pay for land. So in that one I showed you, the Monroe, we said we wanted 15% affordable housing, and we got 56 affordable units. We got slightly less for the land. So governments need to start fronting up and saying, you have to, with new development, provide a percentage of affordable housing. This is done, in other countries around the world, and 20% is not an unusual thing to ask people to provide as they do new development. So we've let the developers get away with a lot, and the time's come now where we need to start saying, no, you can build in our city, you have to build quality, but you've got to build some affordable dwellings with your dwelling. And if that means that they're going to pay less for the land, well, that might be a good thing, because land prices got ridiculous, and maybe a leveling off of those land prices would be a good thing.
Okay, fantastic. We have Vizja. Would you like to turn on your mic?
Yes, it's Vishnu.
Sorry, apologies.
That's okay.
Vishnu.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm in Melbourne as well, Rob. Just quickly, I did live in the city. I was one of those people that lived in the city in high rise, and I worked in the city. Did not own a car, so I'm definitely one of the people that Project 3000 was part of. And I think a lot of the changes that your team and the people that you were working with certainly helped. However, I'm now living in the outer suburbs, and I actually have a landscaping business, and I do design and I do landscaping. And one of the things that I have become acutely aware of is that when the developers are now trying to get value, I'll call it value for money per square metre of land, they're not thinking about the usefulness of that land to the actual person that's going to be using that small courtyard. So we really need to look at how those courtyards are going to be used, not just when they look pretty on a picture, but in the future. For example, if someone wants to put in a deck or concreting, we're now looking at having to put in concrete pumps going through actual houses because there's no access from the back. Yeah. Things like that. So while on a larger scale it looks like it's working, in the more dense housing, and I'm talking about inner and outer more dense housing, the planning is not there for how that home or how that more dense housing will be used by the eventual family or whoever. And I really think that we need to start looking more broadly if we want to take advantage, because what I've found is people are now getting into those houses, and then 2-3 years later they're just getting out and they're going and buying bigger blocks of land because they can't do what they wanted to in their courtyard. So I think there really needs to be a lot more thought put with the developers there.
Sure. Look, I can't disagree with you. I think we Australians are still getting used to what it means to live in a denser built environment, and it's not as though this is a new thing. It's done all over the world, and particularly in Asia and Europe. But you're right. You need to start thinking about, if someone wants to grow something, where are they going to get the water from and how they're going to drain it.
Exactly. And having been someone who was born overseas and having lived in Europe, intermittently, between here and Australia. The idea, going back to what, if we look at European cities and even cities of Melbourne, and talking about the laneways and even the older laneways of areas such as, say, Carlton or Brunswick, if we're going to go ahead and start looking at that density housing, we need to start making allocations for those laneways, and then people will have the access.
Yeah, no, look, I agree with you. I might see if there's someone else who wants to put something in, and thanks for that question. I think it's a very observant one.
Thank you, Vishnia. Thanks, Rob. I don't think anyone else has any question. Please feel free to type in the chat, but I'm going to quickly ask you a question that I have, because actually Vuk and I were discussing or talking about you before the talk, and we were just thinking, Rob is an absolute, visionary person, and I mean, we need people to have those really broad visions for our cities, across Australia, not just, Melbourne. I mean, you did a fantastic job, but what are the strategies to take it to the next level? Like for younger, architects and urban designers, do you have any advice how we can go from here? And what are your visions for the future? What should we do?
I think there are a few things we need to do. First of all, I think governments need to stop contracting out their intellect. I think governments should have in-house teams like the one I was lucky enough to have in Melbourne, which was highly unusual. I ended up with 85 people whose sole purpose in life was to design and make the city better, and not just by themselves, in partnerships and working with all the other departments. So we need to re-establish that intellect within government so that they know how to articulate what they're trying to achieve. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, many of us are operating with planning schemes that are so redundant. They've come from the 1950s and they've slowly been changed. I mean, what happened with the modernist movement is they zoned cities. They created different zones for different cities. You look at our planning schemes, they're still zoned cities. We've got 76 different zones in our planning scheme. There are only 3 zones in a city. It's either an area of maturity that is grown up and you want to keep in that way, and you're into a policy of conservation. Or you're in an area that's going through transition. And as long as you can work out what you want to transition to, you can simply write the rules about how you transition. And then the third piece is your new pieces of city, your new sites, if you're opening them up, and there you can write the rules for them. So the mechanisms we've got to change our city are actually working against us, and planners aren't going to change them because planners love them. It gives them more work to fight through VCAT and the various tribunals, because nobody else understands them. They've become too complicated. And I know that sounds harsh, but it's absolute reality. And so governments need to get to the stage where they say, what are we trying to achieve? What are the simple mechanisms we need to change to do that? And let's start, for instance, not expanding our cities and actually making them more compact cities, because that's going to save us money. And that would open up a huge amount of work for, urban designers, planners, designers to actually start retrofitting our cities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rob. It was really great to have you on board. Thank you so much for your time. Actually, I know you're very busy. Appreciate your contribution. I would also appreciate if you can share your slides with us. That would be great.
I'll send those to you.
Fantastic.
And the little message came up on the screen. What is the best book to look at? If you Google the value of good urban design New Zealand, up will come the Department of Environment. One of the authors was Chris MacDonald. Have a look at that, and there's a chart in that about 10, 12 pages in that actually shows those 5 things. I think you'll find that a very useful document.
Okay, fantastic. I think, thanks, Belinda. Harrison also asked, from a regional city that is rapidly increasing its suburban areas built on essential farming land, and as a result, it has created massive congestion. in out central business districts. How do we sell public transport as a part of many actions we can use to address the density issues?
Well, I think we've got to start putting in better, more efficient public transport. And in Melbourne, we're going to have to bite the bullet at some stage. If you're running a tram down a street, maybe you're not running cars down that street at the same time. So the trams actually get a headway and speed that make that transport more efficient. Now, I think that's possible because I think with the way that our cities have become more flexible post-COVID, you could say, for instance, in Brunswick Street, that between 7:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning, that's a car-free street. And public transport and bikes get it. And after that, you can bring the cars back in. That way, you would get really rapid service into the central cities. I pointed out the trackless tram, which Peter Newman's working on, and you might want to ask him to have a chat to you, because I think that's a bit of technology that Western Australia is leading with out at Stirling. And that means you can start to put, high volume, medium tier transport into your cities. So some of those outer areas that have been devoid of public transport might start to get it at a far more economical rate. Whatever we do is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take us 30, 40 years of slowly changing our cities. And that's frustrating for some people, particularly politicians who sometimes only around for 3 or 4 years.
And that's the reality. All right. Fantastic book. Did you want
Rob,
to say?
thank you very much. As I said, my voice isn't the best today, so I'm going to write you a short email afterwards thanking you, but thank you for all the people watching. This will be saved, obviously, in the ArchiTalk
website, yes.
Rob, thank you very much.
Okay, look, my pleasure. Sorry about the technology glitches.
No problem. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.